Mr. President, Prime Minister, Ministers, Ambassadors, Excellencies, dear friends. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you here today to the Second Assembly of the Arctic Circle. It is a gathering for dialogue and discussion, a new forum for wide-ranging and dynamic cooperation on the future of the Arctic. When we launched the Arctic Circle last year, it was from the very beginning endorsed with constructive engagement by governments of Arctic states and leading powers in Europe and Asia, by institutions of science and research, large corporations and environmental organizations, indigenous communities, concerned activists and citizens alike. The fundamental principle of the Arctic Circle is to invite all partners to convene sessions in their own name and with full authority over their respective agendas, and also authority over the selection of speakers in their own sessions. This is the hallmark of our common endeavor, presenting both the democratic spirit and the vision of inclusion and equality, which has for so long characterized the Arctic cultures. At the first assembly last year, we welcome here today, at the opening of the second assembly, more than 1,400 participants from about 40 countries, consolidating the Arctic Circle as the most comprehensive international gathering on the Arctic. But we have gained strength and support from the engagement of so many, and your enthusiasm, response, and cooperation has now enabled us to consolidate the Assembly of the Arctic Circle as a permanent annual event here in Harpa, transforming Reykjavik every October in the years to come into a dynamic Arctic village, where anyone with a view can make their voices heard. The dates for the 2015, the 2016, and the 2017 assemblies have already been decided, and you can find them at the back of your program. So we hope you all put them in your diaries for the coming years. In addition, the Arctic Circle Secretariat, in cooperation with our partners and advisors, is already planning separate Arctic Circle forums in other countries. They will be smaller in size and with focus on specific agendas and approaches. And hopefully we will see such forums hosted next year in Greenland, in the United States, and in Singapore. We are profoundly grateful to our partnering organizations, both for their financial support, but also for their intellectual and substantive input, their ideas, proposals, and practical suggestions. Their goodwill and positive engagement is the key to the success of the Arctic Circle, once again manifesting the positive spirit of Arctic cooperation. But I also express here today my warmest thanks to the young people who have, throughout this year, led our Secretariat with such dedication and fine-tuned diplomacy. It has been an extraordinary challenge to align this diverse and distinguished gathering within a comprehensive program, to organize these highly active 3 days. And the work of these young people is a testimony to the professionalism and the dedication of our new generation. I know that some have noted that the sessions are indeed many, that the scope of our agenda is perhaps overwhelming. But the multitude of topics reflects the growing complexities of the Arctic debate, and also the increasing number of active partners and profound challenges facing the Arctic and also the entire world in coming years and decades. The northern regions, which for centuries were isolated and remote, mostly unknown to the rest of the world, have now become a global theater, reflecting the economic, political, and environmental importance of the Arctic for every continent and country in the world. If a few years ago some were surprised by the new term, the global Arctic, they now only have to look around in this magnificent hall and witnessed in the coming days representatives from so many countries participate in dialogues and discussions and filling every room here in this great building, large or small, and also in some neighboring facilities with their meetings and sessions, and engaging in networking activities in the public spaces and on the balconies surrounding us. Thanks to the people who on a daily basis run this extraordinary building, which, by the way, has won distinguished European architectural prizes, we can now transform it into a true Arctic village, strengthening the foundation of our cooperation and friendship, and creating new partnerships, working together towards a sustainable future, not just for the Arctic, but also for planet Earth. And I hope when the Assembly closes on Sunday, we will all be richer in experience, in knowledge, in wisdom, in friendships and partnerships. Looking forward to meet here again next October and in the years to come, transforming, as I said before, the northernmost capital of the world every October into a fascinating international Arctic location. And with these words, I welcome you again and ask my good friend and Arctic Circle partner, Alice Rokoff, the founder of Alaska Dispatch, to chair the opening sessions. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Prepare yourselves for a jam-packed agenda for the next few days. We hope we don't overwhelm, but our theory is more is better than less, and then you can have a whole year to reflect on all the massive amounts of information we're conveying to you. My role for the next few minutes is just to introduce our very distinguished speakers, heads of state, some addressing you by video. But for the moment, could we please invite the Prime Minister of Iceland to the stage? It's with great pleasure that I introduce Sigmundur David Gunnarsson.
President of Iceland, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, President of Finland, Mr. Sauli Niinistö, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am extremely pleased to be here today to address the Arctic Circle in this beautiful conference hall, Harpa. I sometimes say that Iceland sits in the front row of witnessing climate change and its consequences. We can, therefore, offer the best seats and are centrally placed to host events on the Arctic. This is the second time the Arctic Circle assembles, and it is deservedly attracting ever more attention worldwide. The quality of the working sessions and the level of participation from state actors, local communities, non-governmental organizations, private sector enterprises, and science alike make the Arctic Assembly quite unique in form and size. I want to thank President Grímsson for his initiative at the time and his continued engagement, and the organizers and sponsors for their hard work and commitment. The timing of this assembly is also opportune. Last month, I attended the United Nations Climate Summit in New York, to which UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon invited world leaders from government, finance, business, and civil society to galvanize climate action and mobilize political will for a meaningful climate agreement next year. Climate change is not a far-off problem. It is happening now, and at the summit, I found it particularly revealing to witness how the global challenge of climate change can have intertwined consequences as well as local and a direct impact on people's lives, from Thule to Tuvalu, as the awarded documentary by Matthias von Gunden so powerfully illustrates. It is, however, important to bear in mind that for millennia, we have seen dramatic changes and swings in climate, and global warming is not a recent phenomenon. Ever since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, which resulted in increased greenhouse emissions, the globe has seen higher temperatures. The same applies to the ice sheet in the Arctic, which has receded, on average, by some 11% every decade, at least since the 1970s. And it is a mixed picture. This year, we have indications that the ice cap in the Arctic is not receding. Still, the general trend is clear, and the visual and rapid pace of developments in the Arctic, driven by climate change, but also by strategic considerations and high economic and commercial interests, has focused attention on the Arctic in recent years. The stakes are indeed high. Numbers and figures need to be taken with caution, of course. However, it is beyond a doubt that the region has huge untapped potential when it comes to the extraction of oil and gas. Some estimates say that at least 18% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of gas. In addition, the region is rich of valuable minerals, fish, wood, and hydro. Moreover, alternative transportation routes are opening up, cutting distances by thousands of nautical miles to ever-growing markets in the East, and hence bringing North America, Europe, and Asia closer together geographically and commercially. The number of vessels transiting through the Northern Sea route in 2013 amounted to 71. This may not be a large figure in absolute terms, but the numbers are increasing, from 46 in 2012. And the vessels are carrying ever more freight, already over 1.3 million tons last year. There will be ups and downs in these numbers, but they will, in all likelihood, continue to increase in the long term. Also, climate change will likely increase the potential, but also the necessity of enhanced food production in the Arctic, as demographic factors change and the need for food increases globally. A growing shortage of water is another challenge mankind will be faced with in the not-too-distant future, highlighting the significance of the Arctic's tremendous fresh water supply. Ladies and gentlemen, for centuries, Iceland's economic and social well-being and livelihood has been shaped by the natural riches and climatic conditions of the North. Our interests in the Arctic are manifold, and my government, which took office last year, has identified the Arctic as a policy priority. In fact, there is a fairly broad consensus in Icelandic politics and society on Arctic affairs, and my government's ambition is to maintain and foster this cohesion and continue to build on and develop the principles that underpin our Arctic policy that was unanimously agreed in the Alþingi, the Icelandic Parliament, in 2011. The changes that are occurring in the Arctic are multifaceted and affect our societies in various ways: economically, environmentally, socially, and in terms of security. Therefore, a holistic approach is called for to address developments in the Arctic. With this in mind, last year my government decided to establish a committee of ministers on Arctic affairs, which I as Prime Minister preside over. The committee, which meets regularly, ensures focused political attention and a coordinated implementation of Iceland's Arctic policy. Hereby, a whole-of-government approach is applied, cutting across the various dimensions and complexities that characterize developments in the Arctic. Currently, the committee is in the process of mapping out Iceland's wide-ranging interest in the Arctic in a holistic manner to further underpin our policies and how we prioritize our finances. Ladies and gentlemen, the key to our Arctic policy, however, is cooperation with other stakeholders in the region, which again underscores the importance of having a venue like the Arctic Circle that brings together different people and even different interests, but where we all benefit from dialogue and mutual understanding. Let me first mention the Arctic Council, which remains the most important forum for discussion and decision-making on issues pertaining to the Arctic. The composition of the Arctic Council is quite remarkable and encompassing, and includes not only Arctic member states, but also, and this is important, communities of indigenous peoples and permanent participants. We also see an increasing number of observer states, NGOs, and businesses alike. As a consequence, the Arctic Council now includes 10 out of the 11 largest economies as members or observers, 6 out of the 15 largest oil producers, and 9 out of the 20 largest fishing nations in the world. The Arctic Council is developing with self-confidence from a forum of discussion to a decision-making body with an ever-growing international attention and attraction. 2 legally binding agreements on search and rescue and oil spill response have been agreed to in recent years, which we welcome and would like to see the Council continue to develop in this direction. There are other regional bodies I could mention that are also important in the Arctic discourse, including the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which Finland currently chairs, the Northern Dimension, and the West Nordic Cooperation, which my government also places an emphasis on. And only this week, I attended the Nordic Council session, which approved a revised Arctic strategy. Second, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which all Arctic countries agree should be our guiding light in resolving legal matters and any outstanding disputes. Indeed, the Arctic states have a history and good record in resolving their differences in a cordial and peaceful manner in the High North. We may not agree on all issues everywhere, as certainly is the case these days. However, it remains important to maintain good relations and cooperation in the Arctic, where the stakes are high and our interests in many ways converge. It is quite remarkable, when you think about it, how the Arctic has become a region of stability and cooperation after decades of tension during the Cold War. We must continue to build on this and avoid the slippery slope of military buildups and confrontation in the region. Catchy and often misleading headlines indicating a race for the Arctic should not become a self-fulfilling prophecy. High North, low tension should be the order of the day. Thirdly, let me say a few words on the cooperation between the public and private sector, which is imperative if we collectively wish to exploit the various emerging economic and commercial opportunities whilst addressing inevitable accompanying challenges. And let me be clear, there will be necessary balances to strike between exploitation and conservation in this highly complex and environmentally sensitive region. Public and private actors and enterprises will need to cooperate, share responsibilities, build on each other's strengths, and add capacities where needed. This approach, to marry the potential economic advantages with the accompanying environmental and security challenges, is an imperative one in my standpoint and cannot only be the responsibility of the state. Here, other stakeholders like municipalities, academia, businesses, and industries all have a role to play. Therefore, I welcome the Arctic Economic Council, which was formally established last month and brings together all relevant parties with the aim of contributing to sustainable and responsible economic and social development in the Arctic. We must, however, never forget that the Arctic will always be the Arctic, not the Mediterranean, to borrow a popular anecdote from the discourse on the Arctic. Although it is warming up for business, we still have to keep our heads cool. The weathers in the Arctic will continue to be cold and unpredictable, and the high seas hazardous. Drifting ice is no less dangerous than bigger icebergs. The region is becoming more accessible, yes, but it is not an open highway. And although the stakes are high for states and businesses alike, we must always remember that there are people, including indigenous peoples, living in these areas whose livelihood and rights need to be fully protected. Ladies and gentlemen, Iceland will remain a responsible partner in the Arctic. My government is currently looking into the possibility of establishing an international rescue and response hub in Iceland. We are strategically located to provide services in a region which, in many places, lacks the necessary infrastructure. My country has good logistical facilities to offer, including international airports, deep ports, medical services, and accommodation facilities. We also have valuable expertise to share, including within our Coast Guard, which is well acquainted with climatic conditions in the north and has, in recent years, invested in high-quality assets for pollution management and search and rescue purposes. Furthermore, the opening up of alternative transportation routes put Iceland in a favorable geostrategic position for the provision of transshipping and other related services. Already, concepts and projects are being developed in this direction, and interest from international operators is increasing. We will also apply the highest environmental standards when it comes to economic and human activities in the area. Icelandic authorities have issued 3 licenses to international consortia for prospecting, exploration, and production of hydrocarbons, as accumulating data indicates that oil and gas is to be found northeast of Iceland. This notwithstanding, Iceland will continue to develop and invest in renewable energy resources. Here, we are in a particularly good position to lead by example, as almost 100% of Iceland's electricity and heating today comes from renewables, mainly hydro and geothermal. Hydro, geothermal, wind, ocean, and solar power will not resolve all our problems, but those are becoming increasingly technologically accessible and reliable energy sources and could be utilized by millions of people worldwide for electricity and heating, including in the Arctic. I could foresee that not only would we apply the highest environmental standards, but also make use of the potential material wealth and dividends to invest further in human capital, necessary infrastructure, and alternative energy resources. This way, we can reap the potential economic benefits of extracting oil and gas, and at the same time, address the importance of sustainability and human investment. Hence, the Arctic paradox of contributing to climate change by utilizing non-renewable resources does not, if properly handled, necessarily have to involve a contradiction in terms. Iceland will also continue to contribute to science in the Arctic. To name just one example, the Vilhjálmur Stefánsson Arctic Institute is currently working on an ambitious Arctic Human Development Report, which will give special attention to Arctic demographics, societies, and cultures, but also the broader issue of climate change. The report is near completion and will be an important contribution to our knowledge of the Arctic. Ladies and gentlemen, you will probably take from my remarks here today that I remain optimistic on the present and future prospects of the Arctic, and I am. I base my optimism partly on the fact that the Arctic is a well-governed area. The institutions and legal arrangements in the region are firmly in place, and the Arctic states have a good record and history in resolving matters pertaining to the Arctic in a cordial manner. By and large, we all share the same vision of cohabitation and cooperation. I am optimistic that we will be able to tread the golden path, find the necessary balances, and address in good cooperation opportunities and challenges alike. It is fitting that we gather here today on the 150th anniversary of the birth of one of Iceland's most loved poets, Einar Benediktsson, who traveled to and lived in many of the countries of the North. He combined in one man a great love and understanding of history and culture, and the enormous potential for economic progress here in the North. Just as this forum combines an understanding of all the different aspects that make the Arctic such a fascinating place. I am confident that you will have an informative and productive weekend here in Harpa. I also hope you will be able to experience and enjoy the vibrant city of Reykjavik and Iceland to some extent. Thank you again for inviting me to the Arctic Circle. I wish you well.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Prime Minister, and we all thank you for your wonderful hospitality. If I could now call to the stage our distinguished visitor, the President of Finland, Mr. Sauli Niinistö.
President of Iceland, Olafur Grímsson, Madam Dorit Musayev, ladies and gentlemen, we like to say that the future of the Arctic is in our hands, for good and bad. It means we have new opportunities in the North. They are mainly economic, things like new resources, faster transport routes, and so on. But it also means we face serious risks. They are mainly, but not only, environmental. I believe the great task that lies ahead of us is to combine these two factors, opportunities and risks, in a way that is sustainable. Sustainable for us, the peoples of the region, and for whole human mankind. Fortunately, we still have the time to strike the right balance. We probably have made some mistakes already, but we still have the possibility of avoiding further, perhaps bigger mistakes. And we have those opportunities left. While discussing the Arctic, special attention should be given to indigenous peoples that have populated the region for thousands of years. They do not only live here, they are part of it. They must have the right to take part in decisions that concern them. The United Nations member states reaffirmed their support for this core principle at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in September. Nature, environment, and climate should always be our starting points, as we ourselves can't exist without suitable conditions. We know that climate change is advancing in the Arctic more rapidly than anywhere else. The rising temperature and the melting ice are directly affecting the 4 million people who live in the Arctic and call it their home. The effects stretch all the way around the globe. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. Of course, tackling the climate change is not only a matter for the Arctic region. It is a global challenge that requires serious effort from all countries. And there we need a global response, which we hope to achieve next year at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris. If we succeed, it will be especially important in the Arctic. Everyone in this room is aware of the special vulnerability of the Arctic nature. It can't sustain and recover from damage, as well as some other neighborhoods of our globe. To put it simple, same mistake, but worse consequences. One should never forget this. Those of us who use Arctic resources and benefit from the region are mainly responsible for managing our environmental risks in the north. How can we then make sure that we do things in a sustainable way? I have no easy solution, but I offer a number of principles that should help us. First, high-quality research is a must in the Arctic. Science is a cornerstone. We really have to know what we are doing, what we can do, and what we cannot do. So we have to research, analyze, and monitor extra carefully in the north. Second, not just any technology suits the Arctic area. We need exactly those technological solutions that enable us to tap the potential while avoiding risks. In a word, we need clean tech which is designed also for these conditions. Third, one can't operate safely in the north without proper Arctic know-how. It is a combination of scientific research, practical experience, and right technology. It should not come as a surprise when I say that Finland actually has all these three in top shape: research, clean tech, and know-how. And if you don't believe me, you have a chance to learn more about our approach during our country session in this afternoon. There will be no successful Arctic policies or practices without Arctic cooperation. After the twilight years of the Cold War, we saw a new kind of international cooperation emerging in the Arctic. On a Finnish initiative, the first meeting between ministers of the Arctic countries was held in Rovaniemi in 1991. It was a historic meeting establishing the idea of the 8 Arctic states. The meeting produced the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy and launched the Rovaniemi process, which then led to the establishment of the Arctic Council. In 2 years' time, the Arctic Council will celebrate its 20th anniversary. During those years, a lot of work has been done to strengthen the Council. Its evolution as an international forum has been impressive. The institutional role of the Council has grown. I believe its role should continue to grow step by step from a decisive shaping forum towards becoming a decision-making organization. All of us have recently witnessed dramatic developments in Ukraine. Russia's actions have damaged international security and cooperation, especially in Europe. However, I'm convinced that we should keep the North and the Arctic Council on a road towards more, not less, cooperation. The Arctic Council is the only circumpolar organization that deals with the specific problems of this region. Should its work get paralyzed, everybody would lose. We do not want that. Dear friends, I started by saying that the future of the Arctic is in our hands. I would like to conclude by rearranging the order of the words in it. Our future might be in the hands of the Arctic. Therefore, we must work with it. We must take care of it. Then it can work with us and take care of us as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Our next message is going to be delivered by video. We have remarks from Angela Merkel of Germany.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren! Eines ihrer Ziele hat diese Konferenz des Arctic Circle bereits erreicht. Sie stärkt die internationale Aufmerksamkeit für die Arktis und ihre geopolitische Bedeutung. In der Tat ist die Region kein abgeschlossener Raum. Was hier geschieht, wirkt sich auf weite Teile unserer Welt aus. Daraus leitet sich eine gemeinsame internationale Verantwortung für die Region ab, außen- und sicherheitspolitisch, ebenso wie wirtschafts- und umweltpolitisch. Umweltschäden wirken sich im sensiblen arktischen Ökosystem langfristiger als anderswo aus. Folgen eines Umweltunfalls lassen sich viel schwerer unter Kontrolle bringen. Umso wichtiger ist das Vorsorgeprinzip als Richtschnur der Arktispolitik. Daher würde ich es begrüßen, intensiver darüber nachzudenken, bestimmte Gebiete in der Arktis unter besonderen Schutz zu stellen. Ohnehin hat die Region geradezu Symbolcharakter im weltweiten Bemühen um eine Eindämmung des Klimawandels. Ob es gelingt, die 2-Grad-Obergrenze für die Erderwärmung einzuhalten, entscheidet sich natürlich an anderer Stelle, und zwar dort, wo im hohen Maße die Treibhausgase entstehen. Aber wie dringend ein entschlossenes Vorgehen ist, das zeigt sich gerade in der Arktis. Hier lassen sich die dramatischen Folgen des Klimawandels unmissverständlich ablesen. Grundlage für den Erfolg unseres politischen Handelns sind vor allem fundierte Kenntnisse. Deshalb engagiert sich Deutschland stark in der Klima- und Umweltforschung und dementsprechend auch für die Forschung in der Arktis. Zwischen den Arktis-Anrainern, Deutschland und anderen interessierten Staaten bestehen ausgezeichnete Forschungsbeziehungen. Beispielhaft dafür steht unter anderem das internationale Arctic Science Committee, dessen Sekretariat in Deutschland seinen Sitz hat. Unser Land steht mit seinen Forschungskompetenzen und seinem Know-how im Klima- und Umweltschutz als Partner zur Verfügung. Das hat die Bundesregierung auch in ihren Leitlinien der deutschen Arktispolitik klar zum Ausdruck gebracht. Deutschland bekennt sich zu internationalen und regionalen Abkommen. Es ist richtig, dass sich die Arktis-Anrainerstaaten auf das internationale Seerecht berufen. Auch Deutschland ist die Bewahrung des Rechts auf freie Schifffahrt wichtig. Uns liegt aber ebenso an einer konsequenten Umsetzung der Abkommen zum Schutz der Meeresumwelt. Gemeinsam mit den Arktis-Anrainern sowie im Rahmen der Europäischen Union kann und will Deutschland seinen Beitrag zu einer aktiven Arktispolitik ausweiten. Um im Sinne einer nachhaltigen Entwicklung wirtschaftliche Chancen zu nutzen und das sensible arktische Ökosystem zu schützen, setzen wir auf Kooperation und Koordination. Daher, sehr geehrter Herr Präsident Grimson, begrüße und unterstütze ich Ihre dankenswerte Initiative zu einem umfassenden Dialog. Allen Teilnehmern und Gästen der 2. Konferenz des Arctic Circle wünsche ich einen aufschlussreichen und gewinnbringenden Gedankenaustausch.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is a distinguished minister of the state of Singapore. Please welcome Sam Tan Chin.
His Excellency Oliver Grimson, President of Iceland. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. I would like to begin by thanking President Grimson for inviting Singapore to the 2nd edition of the Arctic Circle Assembly. It is also an additional honor for Singapore to share the stage, in a manner of speaking, with the President of Finland, the Prime Minister of Iceland, and also Chancellor of Germany. I would also like to congratulate the Icelandic government for the excellent arrangements and also for the impressive turnout in this year's assembly. in such a short time, the Arctic Circle Assembly has established itself as an important platform for inclusive, open, and constructive dialogue on the Arctic region. Last year, as some of you may remember, I spoke about the reasons why Singapore, a city-state just 1 degree north of equator, is showing such a close interest in the high north. During last year's assembly, I also sketched out some ways in which I thought that Singapore could make a modest but practical contribution to the Arctic. And Singapore's contribution can be sketched out in 4 areas: environmental protection, development of a safe Arctic region, sustainable economic development, and development of human capital. The last 12 months have been a very steep but enriching learning curve for Singapore. I have seen a little bit more of the Arctic, and I also met many knowledgeable people who know the Arctic well and care deeply for the region. So my visits and conversations have left me more convinced than ever of how precious the Arctic is in all senses of the word, but also how fragile. We have learned much, thanks to the generosity of our friends and partners, many of whom are here in this assembly today. So we understand a little bit better now on how Singapore can contribute to the development objectives of the Arctic forums like the Arctic Council and the Arctic Circle. But there is still much more to learn. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, changes in the Arctic continue to gather momentum. It is instructive, for instance, that in the summer of 2013, 71 vessels sailed the route between the Bering Strait and the Barents Seas. This was a 54% increase from 2012, when 46 vessels sailed the Northern Sea route. When we compare to just 4 vessels sailing the route in 2010, I think the change is even more dramatic and remarkable. Prospects of a further expansion of shipping and other maritime activities in the coming years render more urgent efforts to establish an international rules-based framework for Arctic shipping that is consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Singapore therefore supports the early conclusions of the Polar Code currently being developed in the International Maritime Organization. We are also happy to note that the steady progress on the Polar Code and will work with others to see through the conclusion of the code early. Ladies and gentlemen, the need to develop effective responses to emergencies such as oil spill in Arctic waters is also greater than ever. We can pool our experiences and increase knowledge on shipping safety issues. At the working group level in the Arctic Council, the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore has shared Singapore's experiences in oil spill management based on Singapore's experience in responding to and cleaning up an oil spill from the collision of 2 crude oil tankers in the Straits of Singapore in 1997. The pooling of expertise can also drive the development of constructive solutions in the field of emergency preparedness in the Arctic, including through technology. So Singapore is presently collaborating with Norway to develop and test marine versions of an unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, for the monitoring of oil spills and other marine incidents. The UAV will be able to move at a speed of 5 to 10 meters per second and provide an aerial picture of oil spill incidents that can be magnified tenfold. It is not only in matters of technical expertise that non-Arctic states like Singapore have a role to play. Awareness on the changing Arctic needs to go beyond the region. After all, those changes have global implications. Last year, I gave several examples of how changes in the Arctic have wide-ranging ramifications for our environmental security and our maritime interests. Singapore is therefore happy to have taken steps to bring the unique nature and culture of the Arctic a little closer to Singapore in recent months. Last April, we were privileged to host a visit by the Canadian Inuit storyteller, Mr. Michael Kosugard, and his wife, Geraldine. Through the enthralling and interactive stories, Singaporeans of all ages learn about the age-old Inuit traditions. Michael and Geraldine also share with us what it is like to live in the Arctic of the 21st century, enjoying modern housing and education, but also relying on their age-old, rich traditional culture, heritage, and knowledge. In June this year, the Singapore National Youth Achievement Award Council and HSBC sponsored 4 young Singaporeans on a trip to Churchill, Canada, to study the effect of climate change at the Arctic's edge with researchers from the Churchill Northern Studies Center. During the 10-day expedition, these young Singaporeans studied saplings to find out how climate change had affected the area's trees. They even have to deal with the remnants of a summer snowstorm that occurred just before they arrived. I hope that their experiences will inspire more Singaporeans to venture into the Arctic. Indeed, if you may be surprised to know that one can find Singaporeans living in faraway corners of the Arctic. When I visited White Horse in Yukon, Canada last month, I was surprised to find a mini Singaporean community living in Whitehorse. And in Akureyri, Iceland, 2 years ago, I met a Singaporean who was cooking up a storm in his own restaurant, serving the local people. So the presence of all these small Singapore communities in the Arctic is perhaps a sign of increasing interconnectedness between the equatorial Singapore and the Arctic. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Singapore might have started out as an unfamiliar face in the Arctic. I hope that you are now a little bit more better acquainted with us in the last 1 to 2 years. Singapore does not have a direct stake in the Arctic and its rich natural resources, but we have a stake in supporting responsible development and good governance of the region. Arctic states have adopted an enlightened approach towards regional cooperation. The Arctic Council is a good model of political consensus building and functional cooperation, including at the scientific level. The fact that the Arctic indigenous communities, or the permanent participants in the Council, have been given full consultative status in the Council is also uncommon among regional organizations, architectures. There are also other regional and sub-regional platforms for discussions of Arctic issues, including this very forum. They might have some overlapping involvement and agenda. This situation reminds me very much of the approach that we had taken in Southeast Asia and the broader Asia-Pacific region. We called it variable geometry in regional cooperation, and also a constructive duplication. It may give rise to some duplication and competition from time to time, but given the complexity of the challenges in the Arctic, the existence of these different forums with different configurations will be useful. They foster dialogue, forge better mutual understandings, and generate initiatives for collaboration. This benefits the region as a whole over a longer term period. Moving forward, Singapore is looking forward at creating opportunities for stakeholders of the Arctic to come to Singapore to broaden and deepen the dialogue that we have begun. We have thought of 2 different ways. First, we have started programs to facilitate people-to-people exchanges between Singapore and the Arctic indigenous communities. We offer scholarships for short professional enrichment courses conducted under the Singapore Cooperation Program on relevant aspects of policy and public administration, such as port management, public health, and human capital development. We also offer a postgraduate scholarship for the Masters of Law Maritime Law program at the National University of Singapore. The curriculum of this 1 year's master's program includes the law on commercial shipping, marine insurance, shipping regulation, and ocean policy. Over and above these scholarships, we also organize study visits for representatives of the 6 circumpolar organizations representing the various indigenous communities in the Arctic. These communities face the challenge of adapting to and managing change while preserving their innate and fundamental cultural strengths forged over many generations, over many centuries. We believe that there is much that we can learn from their law and traditions, including in contextualizing responsible development strategies in the Arctic, and we look forward to welcoming these representatives to Singapore for a study visit next month. Second, we also would like to work further with Arctic states and stakeholder organizations to bring high-level discourse on Arctic issues to Singapore. Singapore is already working with Norway and Canada to mount a few thought-provoking exhibitions and events to inspire conversations about the Arctic. And we have lined up 1 or 2 more such exhibitions in 2015, which incidentally is also a milestone year for Singapore as we mark the 50th anniversary of Singapore's independence since 1965. To cap these events, in November 2015, I'm pleased that the 3rd editions of the Sustainable Ocean Summit will be held in Singapore. I'm also pleased that in conjunction with the Singapore Summit, the Arctic Circle will also hold a 1-day seminar in Singapore, as announced by President Grimson just now. This forum will be a fulfillment of the visions of President Grimson's thought when he conceived the idea of Arctic Circles. He thought it important to spread the Arctic gospel, or you may call it Alleluia, far and wide. And in Singapore is very happy to offer a staging point for that mission. I therefore hope to welcome you all in Singapore next year. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have every confidence that the 2nd Arctic Circle Assembly will add much to the international dialogue on the Arctic. I'm also very sure that it will sow the seeds of meaningful partnership and mutually beneficial collaborations that will serve our common interests in the Arctic. Together, I think we can make Arctic a better, safer home for the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And our last message of welcome will be from the Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Jose Gurria.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to address the 2014 Arctic Circle Assembly. The Arctic Circle has become an essential platform for multilateral cooperation and one of the most climate-sensitive and resource-rich regions of the world. I want to thank President Grimson for his invitation to this important event. The 2014 Assembly of the Arctic Circle is gathering once again at a challenging moment for the world economy. 6 years into the crisis, the economic recovery is still hesitant, and the global economy continues to grow at a modest and uneven pace. And at the same time, we're preparing for a turning point in the global commitment to tackle climate change. The COP21 in Paris at the end of 2015. We need growth, certainly, but we need it to be green, sustainable, and inclusive. There is no other acceptable option, no other way. We are on a collision course with nature, and we need to change that course. Now, in the Arctic, we have a unique opportunity to do things right. Countries in the region look at the Arctic as a potential new source of wealth, especially its largely unexplored natural resources, and the new shipping routes that are becoming accessible in a warmer climate. Many other countries could benefit from the opening up of the Arctic, boosting global economic activity. But to focus on economic gains alone would be short-sighted. One fundamental lesson from the recent crisis is that short-term economic benefits can hide long-term systemic risks. As countries in the Arctic region seek new economic opportunities, it is important not to overlook the potential dangers of new ventures and their effect on the environment. Climate change is, after all, the biggest systemic risk of all, and its impact on the Arctic region will be one of the largest. Now, today, we know that climate change is faster and more severe in the Arctic than in most of the world. The region is warming at a rate of almost twice the global average. Since the 1970s, Arctic sea ice has decreased by 14%, and in 2012, it hit the lowest level ever recorded, breaking the previous record set in 2007. Now, to avoid the potentially catastrophic effects of climate change, we must limit the warming of the Earth to below 2 degrees. And to achieve this, we need to eliminate all emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels in the second half of the century, what we call zero net emissions from fossil fuels. Now, there are certainly some encouraging signs, but we are still swimming against very strong tides. We have moved from a world of threatened oil scarcity to one of potential abundance. Further oil discoveries, like those that are taking place in the Arctic region, add to existing environmental challenges and risk taking us further away from our current trajectory. At the OECD, we're working very hard to help countries achieve this transition to zero net emissions, identifying best practices, setting green global standards, and providing effective policy recommendations. For example, putting a price on carbon. And let me repeat this loud and clear. Putting a price on carbon. Or replacing fossil fuel subsidies by direct income support to low-income households. And you can do this with the same economies that you derive from stopping the subsidies. And also tackling regulatory and market rigidities that favor fossil fuel incumbency in the electricity sector, for example. Now, we know these are ambitious steps, but we need a civilizational change, a culture change. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this crisis has given us a unique opportunity to improve our economies, to improve our governance, to improve our future. It was a wake-up call. The Arctic region is at the front line of climate change action. How you address this global challenge will set an example for us all. Countries from the Arctic region can take the lead, setting new environmental standards and controls which will permit sustainable use of natural resources while limiting overexploitation and the risk of catastrophic accidents in such a fragile environment. Multilateral cooperation is essential for green growth, and we are excited to see the Arctic Circle taking action to foster this cooperation. So let's strengthen those ties. Let's accelerate our efforts. Remember, we are literally skating on thin ice. Our safety is our speed. Have a great plenary session, and thank you.
Well, now we get into the much more local conversation. So can I invite Vincent Rigby to the stage, please? Vincent is the chair of the Senior Arctic Officials, and he is Canadian, of course. We look forward to hearing your perspective.
President Grimson, Prime Minister Gulagson, President Nisto, fellow speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It gives me great pleasure to be here today in Reykjavik and to be participating in the second Arctic Circle Assembly. And I want to congratulate Iceland, and in particular its president, for initiating and hosting this forum. This is an important gathering, and Canada is very, very pleased to be a part of it. As the chairman of the Senior Arctic Officials, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity this morning to speak to you about the Arctic Council, about its impressive body of work that spans almost 20 years, its strengths and its accomplishments, and the important work that it is doing to promote sustainable development and environmental protection in the Arctic. I've been on the job now for about 4 months. I've had a chance to travel to Canada's north, to Iqaluit, at the beginning of September for the inaugural meeting of the Arctic Economic Council, and also most recently last week in Yellowknife for my first meeting as chair of the Senior Arctic Officials. And I'd like to share with you this morning some of my initial impressions. And I'd like to also mention that the Honourable Leona Gluklak, who is the distinguished chair of the Arctic Council and Canada's Minister for the Arctic Council, could not be here today. However, she asked me to convey her warm greetings to all participants. Let me begin by stating the obvious. The global interest in the Arctic, in its people, its environment, and its prospects for economic and social development is currently unparalleled. I need only look around this room at this impressive and diverse expert audience to see that. You're all here today because you have knowledge and ideas to share and a keen interest in what happens in the Arctic. And part of this interest no doubt stems from the monumental changes that are currently happening in this region. These changes are leading to new and exciting opportunities, both for growth and for prosperity, but they are also leading to a number of new challenges, including social and environmental. As the leading intergovernmental forum for cooperation on Arctic issues since its establishment in 1996, the Arctic Council must do its part to address these changes and to seize these opportunities in the best interests of Northerners. The Council's governance structure contributes greatly to its success and its ability to respond to the changing Arctic. Here I'm specifically referring to the unique feature of the Council, where the 6 Indigenous permanent participant organizations not only sit at the table with the 8 Arctic states, but also contribute actively to the decision-making process, and they play a leadership role on important initiatives. The permanent participants are what connects the Council to Arctic indigenous peoples and communities. I saw this firsthand at the Senior Arctic Officials meeting last week, where permanent participants brought valued perspectives and insights to the table. And I'd be remiss if I did not also mention that many accredited observer states and organizations, that they are increasingly making valuable contributions to the Council's working groups and to their task forces. For example, Germany, which has been an observer since the very year the Council was established in 1996, has a long-standing interest in Arctic scientific research and has recently been involved in the Council's work to address black carbon and methane emissions that affect the Arctic region. And Singapore, one of the Council's newest observers, has been contributing to the development of a plan to enhance Arctic migratory bird conservation along the Eurasian Flyway. These are both excellent examples of how observer action can enhance the Council's efforts. Since its inception, the Council has carried out focused scientific assessment work to address a variety of sustainable development and environmental protection issues facing the Arctic. I've been struck in my time as SAO chair by the quality and volume of products related to both the natural and social sciences, some of which are truly groundbreaking. These range from the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment and the Arctic Human Development Report, which were both done in 2004, to the 2009 Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, and most recently to the 2013 Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, just to name a few. These assessments have not only helped build our collective knowledge and understanding of the Arctic region, but have led to recommendations to help guide states in the development of their Arctic policies. And while this important assessment work continues to be at the core of the Council's activities, the Council is also evolving and undertaking new activities that help influence and that help shape policy. This includes more of an emphasis on recommendations for action, and as mentioned earlier this morning, also the development of legally binding agreements, such as the 2011 Agreement on Maritime Search and Rescue Cooperation and the 2013 Agreement on Cooperation in Marine Oil Pollution Preparedness and Response, both of which were signed by all Arctic states under the auspices of the Council. We've been witnessing a gradual, and I would say necessary, evolution of the Arctic Council over the last 18 years. And why is this necessary? Because as the people of the Arctic learn to adapt to the changes taking place in the region, the Council must also adapt its work and priorities to address new challenges effectively and to seize upon the new opportunities that change is bringing to the region. And under Canada's chairmanship theme, Development for the People of the North, we're aiming to do precisely that. I fully expect that one of Canada's legacies, one of the things that will be remembered for as Arctic Council Chair, will be the greater focus it has placed on the human dimension of Arctic Council activities. We set out to ensure that during our chairmanship, the Council undertakes concrete, results-oriented activities that help address the changes that are occurring and provide real benefits for the people, the actual people on the ground who live in the region. Canada consulted widely across the Arctic in the preparation of its chairmanship priorities, and this is what we came away with. The best example of this is seen in our flagship initiative to create a new circumpolar business forum, the Arctic Economic Council. This is an independent body led by the private sector and officially founded in early September, and it will help to ensure that businesses of all sizes across the Arctic region work together to facilitate Arctic-to-Arctic trade and investment and do so in a responsible and a sustainable manner. We're looking forward to seeing the Arctic Economic Council create its own legacy over the coming years as it works to increase the prosperity of Arctic communities, and we're very happy to see that its executive committee will be meeting on the margins of this conference in the next couple of days. In addition to the AEC, other priority initiatives are furthering this increased focus on the human dimension. For example, we are exploring ways to promote the traditional ways of life of Arctic inhabitants, and we are developing recommendations on how to better incorporate traditional knowledge into the Council's work across all of its priorities. Some Arctic states, including Canada, the US, and the Kingdom of Denmark, already include traditional knowledge in legislation because it leads to better end results in science and research, and we recognize that the Council work could benefit as well. We're also working to support the well-being of Arctic residents, including efforts to promote mental wellness, prevent suicides, and increase the resilience of circumpolar communities. On the environment, we are building on the Council's extensive work in dealing with climate change in the Arctic. A special task force is developing actions to reduce black carbon and methane emissions, realizing both health and climate benefits. And we are also creating an online climate change adaptation portal so that Northerners, researchers, and policymakers can share experiences and share best practices. And recognizing the importance of pollution prevention, the Council is also developing an action plan to prevent marine oil pollution that could arise from increased shipping and oil and gas activities right across the region. All of this work is helping to make sure that the Council continues to be relevant, that it continues to be responsive, and that it continues to be effective. And in talking to people over the last several months, I'm convinced that this approach continues to garner tremendous support. And we are looking forward to highlighting these priority initiatives along with the rest of the Council's accomplishments during Canada's chairmanship at a showcase event in Ottawa on April 23rd and at the ministerial meeting to be held in Iqaluit on April 24th and 25th. And if last week's SAO meeting in Yellowknife is any indication of the progress we're making on some of the important initiatives I've just been discussing, then I feel we're going to have a highly successful ministerial meeting. And it's at the Iqaluit Ministerial that Canada will pass the torch over to the United States, which will then commence its second two-year term at the Council's helm. No doubt you will hear more on the program the U.S. is planning for the Council when Admiral Papp takes the podium a little bit later this morning. We got a bit of a taste test, if I can call it that, at the SAO meeting last week in Yellowknife. I have to say that the U.S. program is exciting, it's ambitious, and I'm very glad to see that it builds on a lot of Canada's emphasis on helping to improve the economic and living conditions of Northern residents. Before closing, I'd like to reflect for a moment on where the Council has come from and where it is going to in the future. Cooperation among natives and among nations and peoples has been the hallmark of the Council over the past 18 years. It's at its very core. And going forward, especially in this time of profound change in the region, we must continue to work together and to learn from each other. Each Arctic state is a temporary steward of the Council during its two-year chairmanship. But of course, the work that needs to be done doesn't stop after those 2 years have passed. All members of the Council know that to make a real difference, we need to continue to take a longer-term view of our work and build a stronger Council and a better Council. I witnessed this dedication and commitment at last week's meeting in Yellowknife, which I have to say was truly, truly inspiring. And I believe this is how we will achieve real results for the benefit of the people who call this region their home. As the Council approaches its 20th anniversary, we should aim for nothing less. Again, I'm looking forward to participating in Arctic Circle discussions over the coming days, which I believe can play an important role in advancing the Arctic dialogue at a truly critical time. And it's also a role that is complementary, very complementary to the work of the Arctic Council. And I look forward to working with all of you in the remaining months of Canada's Arctic Council chairmanship and well into the future in making a difference in the Arctic region. Many thanks.
And now, with pleasure, we're going to have question time. So I can bring you over here. We'll sit down. This is a mic for you. But I'm going to take my squatter's rights and ask the first question. Tell me what your one distilled message would be for the U.S. residents of the Arctic, having been through all of the startup processes that you all have had to undertake. What would you most like to see carried on to benefit the U.S. residents?
This is on.
Don.
I think that's an excellent question, and I've had a chance to go down to Washington and discuss the transition from the Canada to the U.S. chairmanship with Admiral Papp and with other U.S. colleagues. As I said earlier, we got a great presentation at the SAO meeting by the U.S. SAO last week on U.S. priorities moving forward, and I'm really encouraged by what I see in U.S. priorities. I think that there'll perhaps be a slightly different emphasis than what we've seen in the Canadian chairmanship up to this point in terms of maybe a little bit more about climate change and in some other areas. But I think at the end of the day, the continuity of the Arctic Council is extremely important. And I would hope to see, not just for Alaskan residents, but for Northern residents, Indigenous communities, Northerners generally, a continuation of some of those Canadian priorities in terms of putting people front and center in the North. And so continued emphasis on traditional knowledge and local knowledge, emphasis on mental wellness, on suicide prevention, which I think the American chairmanship will take on, sanitation, and and economic development. And I think that the Arctic Economic Council, again, I think is going to be, from our point of view, a flagship initiative. And what we've been hearing in our consultations, and I know the American leadership has been consulting very actively with the Alaskan people, so they've been listening and will incorporate their ideas into their chairmanship priorities. But we've heard again and again and again that sustainable economic development is truly critical for Northerners, and that there are two pillars to Arctic Council activities. There is the climate change pillar, and then there's also the sustainable development piece,
Yeah.
and you need both of those.
Yeah.
So we would like to see a continued emphasis on both.
Thank you. It's a very telling answer, because as I listen to these welcoming remarks from heads of state and people from around the world who look at the Arctic but don't reside in the Arctic, there's very clearly a bifurcated sense of priorities. There's a sense of climate change and its effects on the world as we see through the Arctic, and then there is a sense that the people in the Arctic on the ground may have more pressing and different needs than those who are outside. So,
but I have to say, that they're not mutually exclusive, and so
Cannot be.
environmental protection on the one side and sustainable development on the other, these are actually mutually reinforcing. We would say. And you can't have one without the other at the end of the day. So I think they're very, very complementary. And that's why they're enshrined in the Ottawa Declaration of 1996 as those two fundamental pillars, because they do feed off one another. So they're both important.
audience members, who has the first question? Right there.
Michael Byers from the University of British Columbia. I'd like to follow up on this last question. Canada is the only country to have formally renounced the Kyoto Protocol, and the Canadian federal government has also conspicuously failed to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is growing very quickly in Canada. So my question for Mr. Rigby is, has the Canadian government's lack of leadership on climate change impeded your efforts and that of your predecessor in terms of showing leadership in the Arctic Council in a region that is on the front lines of climate change?
I think if you look at the record of Canada's chairmanship over the last couple of years, and you'll see this at the ministerial in the spring as well, that while we put a lot of emphasis on sort of the human dimension, as I characterized it in my speech, there's been a lot of work on the climate change side as well. And so if you look at the work we're doing in our task force on black carbon and methane, if you're looking at the work we're doing in terms of setting up a adaptation portal, there's a longer list of specific activities. I think we've still more than held our own in terms of climate change activities within the Arctic Council, and we will continue to do that. So I certainly would not want to leave the impression that Canada, under its chairmanship, has focused exclusively on one side of the paradigm to the exclusion of the other. Not at all. And I think that people will see that when the deliverables are announced in the spring of 2015.
Okay, next question.
First, thank you, Mr. Rigsby, for being here and your work with the Arctic Council. I just have a question regarding what you mentioned about building a stronger council and a better council. What does that mean, I guess, or what does that look like in terms of the inclusivity of the council, or perhaps more or less being exclusive? I was wondering if you could explain a little bit further about what you meant by a better and stronger council.
I think that, in terms of inclusiveness, I think the Arctic Council already is very inclusive. When you look at the fact that, as I mentioned, you have 8 states and then 6 permanent participants, and I talked about this unique feature and how important it is. You look at 32 observer states and NGOs and IGOs. At the Yellowknife meeting last week, everybody was there together in the room. It was quite something. I've been to a lot of international conferences. I've chaired a lot of international processes over the years. And as was mentioned earlier, this was quite something, having everybody in the room at the same time. So that is certainly welcome. A stronger Arctic Council, I think we're looking at a number of things. Some of them are quite administrative in terms of really establishing or strengthening the Arctic Council Secretariat that is in Tromsø in Norway, better records management, better archiving, better outreach in terms of a communication strategy. I think that one of the things that we're going to be most proud of, and it sounds very administrative in nature, but we've actually got a tracking chart now of all Arctic Council commitments. So all the working groups and all the task forces, over 80 projects and programs going on at any one time, we have a tracking chart that basically is an update on all those projects, when they're going to be finished, what the timelines are, what they're going to achieve, and we're going to make that public. We're going to actually attach that to the SAO report to ministers in the spring, so everybody can hold the Arctic Council accountable for its actions. And so we think this is a big deal. We're quite proud of it. We're still working on it, more to come. But it is, I think it's going to be, again, it sounds rather administrative in nature, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to have some big impact.
Okay. Lady in pink.
Yes, lady in pink. Maria Mork, a resident of Iceland. I have a question and a remark. Most of the speakers this morning have mentioned the natural resources that are to be found in the Arctic, and most of them also mention oil. Now, I have a question concerning what is being done for renewable solutions in the Arctic already. Most of the things that we are talking about here are business as usual. And then people come and say, we have very good cleanup mechanisms. I would like to see preventive measures, and I would like to ask simply, which preventive measures have been taken already? Because business is actually starting as usual in the area. So please comment on that. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I can't go into detail on what has happened up to this point. I can speak to my experience and what the Arctic Council is working on at the moment. And certainly, when it comes to development of oil resources and so on, and prevention of oil spills, that is something that one of the council working groups is actually focusing on at the moment and coming up with an action plan of sort of concrete actions that the council can take in terms of preventing oil spills and really focusing on that dimension. I think the other piece to look at is in terms of responsible resource development is that I won't speak for the Arctic Economic Council here. It's an independent body led by the private sector, but I think that the work that they're going to be conducting is very much going to focus on the responsible side of resource development and not just sort of a purely commercial dimension. So I think you're going to see some of the work coming out of there as well, focusing on some of the issues that you've talked about.
Yes, on this side.
I've been asked to mention that I'm also the last question for this session here. So my name is Jared Westlink. I'm the Associate Executive Director of the Youth Arctic Coalition. One of the sayings that I kind of go by is that youth are not only leaders of tomorrow, but we're leaders of today. And I know Canada in the past has mentioned its want to engage youth in the Arctic Council and in Arctic issues. So I would like to ask Mr. Rigby how he envisions that happening, both youth being and staying involved in what the Arctic Council is doing, as well as being and staying involved in, as President Grimson says, the Arctic village that we find ourselves in today.
Thank you very much. And you and I had a chance to chat briefly yesterday, and I'm hoping you're going to come see me when you come back to Ottawa, so we can talk about this in more detail. But yes, absolutely. Such a large proportion of the population in the north is made up of youth, and this is the future of the Arctic. So when we talk about sustainable development over generations, it's the region's youth that are going to be front and center in that regard. At the meeting in Yellowknife last week, this came up on a number of occasions, and I had actually said to my SAO colleagues and my permanent participant colleagues that we should be looking at a broader youth engagement strategy for the council. And so this is something that I'd like to put a priority on. Canada is only going to be in the chair for the next 6 months or so, but certainly I would pass that on to my U.S. colleagues and my other Arctic Council colleagues that we need a more coherent, cogent strategy looking at youth engagement activities and youth engagement outreach. There'll be a couple of announcements at the ministerial in the spring. I won't steal the thunder right now of ministers, but I think that broader strategy is necessary, and I'm certainly going to encourage SAOs and permanent participants to take that on in the remaining time as chair.
Thank you. And thank you all. We are going to end this question and answer period, go on to our representatives from the United States, and then have more questions. Thank you very much. And I believe there's a map that's to come up here in background. There we go. This here is by way of introduction to the U.S. perspective on its Arctic presence. I am not going to speak to it at any length, but I thought it's useful background for those of you who are familiar with the view from the North Pole, showing you a transshipment route from Iceland to, for example, Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. The more important point is from the view on the ground in Alaska, we have a coastline that is 2,000 miles long along the Bering Sea, and under U.S. law, that is our definition of the Arctic. So keep that in mind when you look at the circumpolar map that shows just a little bit of Alaska up above the Arctic Circle. That's not our Arctic. Our Arctic, in fact, goes way south through the Bering Sea. And I mention that because, by way of introduction about myself, I'm a transplanted, now resident Alaskan, proudly so. Citizen of Alaska, citizen of the Arctic, but of course citizen of the United States. And the Alaskan view of the Arctic is a view that is upfront, personal, and very, very intimate, in the sense that it's our front porch, our backyard, our food source for all the people who live along the coast and so forth. However, keep in mind that there's a 2,000-mile stretch of coastline there with zero infrastructure. That is the challenge for the United States. Now, Admiral Papp, of course, will be telling you his views of the strategic overview of our goals with respect to the chair of the Arctic Council. I'm simply speaking as a person who lives on the ground in Alaska. So with that as background, first I have the pleasure of introducing the senior senator from the great state of Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, who's going to come up here and speak, to be followed by Admiral Papp, and then we'll all take questions.
Good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. As Alice has introduced me as the Senior Senator of Alaska, a title that I am quite honored to have, but I will give you a little bit about myself. As a born and raised Alaskan, one of my great honors was to be adopted into the Tlingit clan, an area down in Ketchikan where I was born, and given the name Anshawatki, which means Lady of the Land. And I think it goes to part of the passion that I have for my state, for Alaska, and truly the land of the Arctic, the land that makes Alaska truly an Arctic nation. President Grimson, thank you for your leadership, as always. Alice, for what you have done in gathering so many together at this Arctic Circle Assembly, the opportunity to be with you in person this year at this Arctic village here in Harpa. It is indeed a pleasure. I'm pleased to be on the same panel with Admiral Papp, the United States Special Representative for the Arctic. Admiral Papp not only comes with great credentials, having served as the Commandant of our United States Coast Guard, but I think it's important to recognize that his Coast Guard career began with time spent on a Coast Guard vessel out in the Arctic, stationed out at the end of the Aleutian Islands, so he has been immersed in the Arctic for many years. Following Mr. Rigby's presentation and as part of the North American discussion, I'd like to take my time briefly here this morning to touch on a couple of issues. The first being that for as similar in mindset as the Arctic nations are. There really are two different Arctics with different sets of needs. And I was reminded of this very clearly just a few weeks ago when I was with fellow Arctic parliamentarians at the Standing Committee of the Arctic Parliamentarians in Whitehorse. And it was very clear to see the differences, the different Arctics. There is the Arctic in the Nordic nations of Norway, of Sweden, Finland, and of course here in Iceland, where the infrastructure is in place. The infrastructure is developed. There are multiple transportation options. There is reliable telecommunication. There is internet connection that is commonplace. You have access to clean drinking water, affordable energy, particularly in Iceland here, where we see not only affordable energy, but vast amounts of renewable energy. These are all facts that are part of the daily life in this northern Nordic Arctic area. But then there are the other parts of Alaska, of the Arctic. Up in Alaska, in parts of Canada, in parts of Russia, parts of Greenland, that lack so much when it comes to what we would all consider essential services and the investment that brings about these essential services. And we see that in so many parts of the Arctic, these essential services, this infrastructure, this investment is still in the very, very early stages. So it's not uncommon to hear folks from different parts of the Arctic focus on different priorities. And I think we heard a little bit of that this morning in our openings. And that is why you will hear praise from those who live in the North American Arctic for Canada's theme during its chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We heard that expressed by Mr. Rigby, particularly focusing on the development of the people of the North, and why you will hear from so many in my state as we press our U.S. State Department to include economic development and jobs for the people of the Arctic as part of the United States agenda as chair of the Arctic Council, and our support for the newly established Economic Council. For without the expansion of existing and new economic activity, it's very difficult to get to reliable transportation options, to clean and safe drinking water, to wastewater systems that are affordable, that help us reduce the incidence of disease and health complications. And certainly the issue of affordable energy. In Alaska, a state that has enormous potential for our resource development, we pay the highest energy costs of most any state in our country. And it is probably the biggest impediment to our opportunities for development or expansion. And without prospects for economic development, for jobs, it's very difficult to retain the best and the brightest in our remote communities. It's also exceptionally complicated as we deal with the high suicide rates, the domestic violence rates that we experience. Without hope for the future, our communities struggle, and many communities struggle to survive, let alone become self-reliant in a very harsh Arctic environment. So while we recognize that addressing climate change is important, it's critical, and adaptation to climate change should be a significant focus in the Arctic. There is a recognition that it can't be our sole focus. We cannot lose focus on the people of the Arctic. For just as we have a responsibility to the land in the north, just as we have a responsibility for our oceans in the north, we have a responsibility for the people of the north. And we must ensure that our initiatives do not prevent those who live in the Arctic from carefully and responsibly developing the resources that are available within their region, and thus preventing a better standard of living. Now, while there are clearly two different Arctics in terms of infrastructure and in terms of development, it truly is a region of cooperation and collaboration, and we hear these words spoken so frequently. And they're not just buzzwords, they must be real. It must be cooperation, it must be collaboration. But we focus on this because of the similarities that do bind us together. Our relatively small population base makes east-west economic interaction as important as the traditional north-south trade routes. And our common heritages and our culture bind our peoples together across political borders. And it's no coincidence that of the 6 indigenous groups who serve as permanent participants to the Arctic Council, 5 are transboundary entities with membership from multiple Arctic nations. And Alaska has ties to 4 of these groups. The United States, as I have said at the beginning and I say repeatedly, is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. But Alaska's residents are engaged in Arctic issues that go far beyond our political borders and our national priorities. I'm pleased that there are so many Alaskans who have traveled to Iceland to be part of this second assembly here at this Arctic Council. I'm also pleased to welcome a delegation from Maine. So between Alaska to the west and Maine all the way to the east, we're bookending the United States in terms of the interest and focus on Arctic issues. I continue to be asked as I travel around the United States, I continue to be asked by others, why does the Arctic matter to me if I live in Chicago or San Francisco or Miami, Florida? I think the answer to that question is contained right here. Look at the program that we have before us for these next 3 days. Look at the list of participants, representatives from some 40 different countries. The fact that we're having country presentations from Japan, from France, that we hear from Singapore, that Chancellor Merkel is on the video addressing us here this morning. The Arctic matters to the world, truly to the world. And with the upcoming U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, it is an exciting time to be in Alaska. It's an exciting time to see the growing interest in the Arctic locally, nationally, and across our globe. And that is why I'm so pleased to be with you in person at this assembly, honored to share my thoughts, and I'm looking forward to the next step for this amazing, amazing region. Thank you. Thank you. Does it make a difference which?
Doesn't. And now we have the great pleasure to introduce the U.S. Special Representative of the Arctic, Admiral Robert Papp. Good morning.
President Grimson, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here this morning. and I thought that I would be apologizing for being drowsy because I landed here at 6:30 this morning, having left Boston last night, and I've now been up, I think, 30 hours straight. But I feel invigorated. Now, part of that might be the 20-knot headwind that I walked into coming over here. But to the contrary, I believe it's the enthusiasm and the passion and the people in the room that have invigorated me, and I look forward to my time that I'm going to spend with all of you. I was in Boston yesterday to speak to some students at Harvard. In fact, it was the Kennedy School at Harvard. So being at the Kennedy School, and he being one of my heroes, it reminded me of a letter that President Kennedy wrote back in April of 1963. He was accepting an invitation to host the first Operation Sail in 1964 in the United States. Now, President Kennedy did not live to see Operation Sail, but he was a sailor. And in that letter he wrote, "Sailing taught me something of the courage, resourcefulness, and strength of those who sail the sea in ships." And he went on to say that the sight of those ships coming from the distant corners of the world should remind us that strong, disciplined, and venturesome people can still find their way safely across uncertain and stormy seas. Now, I've read a lot of Kennedy's speeches and his letters and other writings, and one of the things that I've learned is Kennedy uses phrases, he uses them literally, and he also uses them figuratively. So that phrase about facing uncertain and stormy seas, I'm sure he meant quite literally, but he also meant it figuratively as well. Kennedy knew that in the future, the people of the world, the people of the United States, would continue to face uncertain and stormy seas. That metaphor for the problems and challenges that we all face in our lives and in the histories of our country. But he also knew that those characteristics of sailors, courage, strength, resourcefulness, discipline, and a sense of adventure would help us to confront those challenges. But I also know that Kennedy didn't think that those qualities were just unique to sailors. Kennedy understood fully that diplomats, that scientists, that economists, that business people, and ordinary citizens have the capacity and those qualities as well to confront the challenges. And that's why this group of people here today, this collection of people from around the world, many different communities, many different talents, are exactly the right types of people to have here to discuss the challenges that we're going to face. And it's why I'm thrilled to be here today as the United States Special Representative for the Arctic. Since my appointment in July by Secretary Kerry, I've traveled the United States, but particularly to Alaska, to meet with our U.S. Arctic partners, including my good friends that have joined me on the stage, Senator Murkowski and Alice Rogoff. Senator Murkowski failed to give a part of her resume, which makes her a part of the family. Her dad was a Coast Guard officer serving in Ketchikan, Alaska when she was born, so she's a part of our Coast Guard family as well. And she's been a great supporter of our Coast Guard, and her passion for Alaska and the Arctic has been contagious. But more importantly, those visits to Alaska introduced me to people like Charlotte Brower and Edward Ida in Barrow, our northernmost town. People like Mayor Reggie Jewell of Kotzebue and Walter Sampson, subsistence hunter who lives in Kotzebue. Mayor Denise Michaels in Nome, and Melody Benke, who's a housewife and also a person that's active in working on Arctic issues of the indigenous people. And I think it's important for me as I take on this new responsibility to keep those people in mind because just like so many people have said this morning, this is about people. Yes, it's about a vast region of our globe, but more importantly, it's about the people and their economic development and their safety and their security. So my 2 trips to Alaska during my first 100 days as the special representative have served to reinforce observations and experiences I've gained during 4 years as Commandant of the Coast Guard during my visits to Alaska. And while I've spoken extensively about the challenges of the Arctic as I've gone around the United States, and I've given testimony before congressional hearings, this is my first international speaking engagement in my new role as the special representative. So I'm so pleased that I can make a debut here in Iceland at the Arctic Circle Assembly, an important international gathering for discussing the opportunities and challenges of the Arctic. President Grimson, I thank you for the invitation to join you here today and for your efforts and those of the Arctic Circle Secretariat in coordinating such a wonderful event. It's truly a pleasure for me to see the incredible gathering of individuals interested in the future of the Arctic. It demonstrates the growing importance of the Arctic, not only among the Arctic nations, but throughout the international community as well. Now, I know many of you have already heard about the proposed program for our upcoming chairmanship for the Arctic Council, and you're probably anxiously awaiting to see some additional details. But before I say more about that, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and commend the Government of Canada for its superb leadership of the Arctic Council that began in 2013 and will continue for another 6 months. With Minister Leona Aglukkaq at the helm, Vincent Rigby, Susan Harper leading the Canadian chairmanship, they've been accomplishing great things. And as they say in my country, they provided us with a tough act to follow. Last week, the United States senior Arctic official Julie Gourley formally presented our priorities to her international counterparts at Yellowknife, Canada. While consensus within the Arctic Council on our proposed program must still be obtained, we look forward to working with our fellow Arctic nations and the 6 permanent participants on launching an aggressive, forward-leaning agenda for the 2015 ministerial meeting. We seek to advance actionable goals with quantifiable results. The proposed theme for the United States chairmanship is what I'd like to focus my remarks on today, because I believe even after our chairmanship ends, this is a message that must carry beyond the scope and authorities of the Arctic Council. Our theme is One Arctic, with shared opportunities, challenges, and most importantly, responsibilities. Our initiatives will fall under 3 categories: improving Arctic Ocean governance and stewardship, addressing the effects of climate change through mitigation and adaptation, and improving economic and living conditions for our Arctic residents. Now, when I look at a picture of the Earth directly down on the North Pole, just as Alice Rogoff has provided up here, as a sailor, I view it as a maritime environment. And the United States is a maritime nation, but also, as the Senator has pointed out, we're an Arctic nation as well. I have always believed that the greatness of a maritime nation can be measured by its commitment to providing for the safety and security of mariners approaching its shores, and that a nation's prosperity is in direct proportion to how well it ensures the safe, secure, and efficient movement of trade and commerce to and from its shores. And that really great nations will also ensure the environmental protection of the sea. Wherever human activity thrives, governments have a responsibility to uphold the rule of law, ensure the safety and security of their people, and ensure that environmental responsible activity takes place. The Arctic is such a place, and the 8 nations and the 6 permanent participants share in those responsibilities. But no one country can manage the Arctic alone, and we have many opportunities and challenges to overcome. We all recognize that climate change is a central theme. The Arctic Ocean is transforming from a solid expanse of inaccessible ice fields to a growing navigable sea, attracting increased human activity and various shared economic and environmental opportunities. The promise of further oil and gas production in the Arctic is increasingly attractive as receding sea ice and improvements in drilling technology make offshore exploration more economically and environmentally feasible than ever before. The past several years have also seen increasingly large numbers of shipping traffic through the Bering Strait, partly due to the increased traffic transiting the North Sea route above Russia. Of course, a changing Arctic does not just bring opportunity, but a significant number of challenges, many of which are shared and have impacts that are felt beyond the boundaries of the Arctic Circle. Over 50,000 Americans call the Arctic their home, many of whose ancestors learned to survive in a harsh Arctic environment thousands of years ago. Today, a rapidly warming Arctic threatens these traditional ways of life that have endured for generations. The Arctic is an area of great biodiversity. Roughly half the fish caught in the United States waters comes from the exclusive economic zone off Alaska. The Arctic is critical to the life cycles and migration patterns of millions of migratory birds and other species each year. The recent effects of climate change are beginning to impact these migration patterns, threatening their survival and traditional practices. Glaciers and land-based ice sheets in the Arctic are also decreasing, contributing to global sea level rise that will impact coastal areas thousands of miles from the nearest ice sheet. Now, we have a commercial back in the United States about the city of Las Vegas for their tourism, and the statement in the commercial is, "What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas." Well, it's apparent for us that, quite to the contrary, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. Likewise, what happens in the rest of the world does not just stay in the rest of the world. It affects the Arctic. Reducing black carbon emissions and methane emissions are worthy goals that we need to work on with the international community to achieve. And I see this as a particular area in which our Arctic Council observer nations can become involved and assist in some of those forward-leaning and actionable outcomes that I mentioned previously. Because in the end, while various parts of the Arctic may differ from one another, as was illustrated earlier by Senator Murkowski, we're all still part of one Arctic, and we need to be working together. Just not coming to agreements on search and rescue and oil prevention, but implementing actionable items and practicing together and learning from each other so that we can assist each other when those emergencies inevitably occur. Those of you in the audience today represent some of the greatest minds when it comes to the Arctic. Present right now are diplomats with the power to influence change, entrepreneurs leading the way in data observations to enhance much-needed maritime domain awareness, and financiers who can support some of those great minds and concepts. The thoughts and the ideas discussed and generated in this assembly over the next few days can influence the future of the Arctic. And I'm very glad to see the university students and young professionals here, because you truly are the future of the Arctic. And it'll be up to you to carry this mission forward with a tremendous opportunity, challenge, and responsibility. So, going back to President John F. Kennedy, it strikes me that in the Arctic, we have the opportunity here to responsibly manage and preserve one of our Earth's greatest assets and its remaining frontiers. The Arctic provides us with an opportunity not entirely unlike the challenge President John F. Kennedy presented to the people of the United States in 1962 when he set a goal of going to the moon. In a famous speech at Rice University, President Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." Now, Kennedy had other day-to-day distractions and problems and challenges that he had to deal with, but he understood that such a mission could not be easily accomplished, but he set the bar high. That's what leaders do. He understood that worthwhile endeavors are hard, and in his speech, and he said setting that goal would, quote, "serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills," end quote. Present today in this auditorium are some of the best energies and skills on the planet. And it is our job, our responsibility to bring them together and work on these challenges and opportunities, because the Arctic is our responsibility. It's a moral obligation of ours that we must all share. As the United States prepares for our future on the Arctic Council and our future in the Arctic, we look forward to working with all of you. Thank you for having me here today.
Can I get you to sit next to Lisa? We have about 10 minutes for questions, even though we're running a wee bit late, so I won't ask one. I'll just let the audience have it. There's somebody lined up at the microphone. It's yours.
Yes. Hello, Your Excellencies, Governor, Ambassador. My name is Valery Protopopov. As you can understand from my unpronounceable name, I'm from Russia, from the very north of Russia. And I have one simple question. What is a vision of you personally or of the states of the United States concerning the intergovernmental, interregional cooperation? Because you say a lot about people living in the north, people that dealing with the northern problems. And what is your plans? Is there any plans concerning the interregional cooperation of the people living in the grounds, on even living on the northern lands? Do you have anything about this? And this question also I wanted to address to your Canadian colleague. Thank you.
Well, thank Thank you for the question. And if I understand you correctly, I think the Arctic Council serves precisely that purpose. It brings together the 8 Arctic nations, but more importantly, it brings together the 6 permanent participants, the people of the Arctic, the people who have lived there and it has been their life for thousands of years. And they have an equal voice in that assembly. And with the observer states, the Arctic Council has been growing each and every session. And I think one of the things that the United States will look forward to is that if you want a seat at the table, being an observer state is not just sitting there and listening. It's being actively engaged. It's participating. Perhaps not just ideas, but perhaps resources as well as we try to develop the northern area.
Actually, I was asking about you are talking about states. States are dealing with big problems, but I'm talking about regions, like state of Alaska, that is dealing with little problems, regional problems. Are you planning to do anything to help people from the regions, from the states, not from the governments, but from the states, from the regions to cooperate, to solve their problems together?
Absolutely. Well, as I said, one of the first things I did upon taking this job was to go to Alaska. Hearing from the various people of Alaska is very important to us. Alice Rogoff, in fact, set up some meetings for me. And when my team went to Alaska in August, we met with our federal representatives, our state, the state legislature. I believe Senator Liesl McGuire is here with us for this session. We met with the Alaska Native organizations. We met with the oil companies. We met with the academics. We want to have all the voices at the table to help form the agenda for the United States as we go forward to the Arctic Council. So this is a very active process for us. And more importantly, from a very parochial point of view for the United States, I think having the chairmanship of the Arctic Council is our best opportunity to get those other 48 states that we talk about, actually 49 including Hawaii, to understand that the United States is an Arctic nation. We have the microphone, we have the ability, and we're going to launch a very aggressive diplomatic and public affairs campaign to make sure that the citizens of the United States understand their obligations in the Arctic as well.
Okay, thank you.
Can we have this side of the room?
Thank you. My name is Heather Exner-Pro from the University of Saskatchewan. And my question is to you, Admiral Papp, on the nature of your role. There's been some excitement and some buzz on the special representative to the Arctic, but maybe not a lot of understanding of what a special representative does. And I understand that you probably won't be the senior Arctic official to the Arctic Council. So would you say your role is to explain the Arctic to the United States, or to explain the United States to the Arctic, or something in between or other than that?
Yes. Next question. No, it's. I would say that there are few people in government in the United States with a role as ambiguous as mine, but I'm gaining clarity on it as I go along. I had planned to be on a long vacation after working for the United States government for 39 years. I had planned to go on a long vacation with my wife and my grandchildren and do some other things. And the night before my retirement, I received a call from Secretary Kerry personally, and he knew the right buttons to press. And I'll talk about this to the youth program here later this afternoon. It has been my goal in my life to have a life of service to my country. So being asked to continue to serve my country was all that Secretary Kerry had to say. Given the fact that it had to do with the Arctic, which I have a passion for, made the job even more attractive. What I would say is, as you know, Secretary Kerry is the chairman of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. Actually, we may have another one because we'll have a national election in 2016 and a change of administration. But Secretary Kerry is the chair. He has a few other things on his plate that he takes care of. So what he's asked me to do is to come into the State Department and be that sort of one point of contact across all the various bureaus, the regional and functional bureaus in the State Department, to coordinate activities having to do with the Arctic. So while the Arctic Council, yes, we already have a senior Arctic official, and we will name very shortly our candidate to take Vincent Rigby's place as the chair of the senior Arctic officials. I'll be at a level before that, sort of minding the day-to-day business for Secretary Kerry as he minds the business of the United States in the world. And also I'll have a broader portfolio for dealing with some of the United States domestic Arctic policy and resourcing issues as well.
Back to this side.
Admiral Papp, I hope you still get that vacation, but not too soon. My name is Lara Satrakian. I'm with the Arctic Deeply Initiative. It's a digital media and public engagement project on the Arctic. I would love your thoughts on what challenges you see in U.S.-Russian relations and engagement during your tenure. What challenges do you foresee, and how do you plan to overcome them?
Well, I'll start off by saying that the United States position, along with many of the countries in the world, are that we are concerned about some of the activities that Russia has been involved in, particularly as it relates to Ukraine. That's no secret. However, for anything to be successful, for peace in the world, for cooperation, for maintaining environmental security and other things, we need to keep the avenues open for discussion. And we view the Arctic as one of those places that's very important, not just to the 8 Arctic nations and the 6 permanent participants, but for the people of the world. And we view this as an opportunity to keep business going. We will continually reassess our position, but right now we welcome the opportunity to keep talking with our counterparts in Russia.
We have time for one final question.
Okay, behind you.
Yes, my name is Rasmus Bertelsen from University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, and Aalborg University, Denmark. And a follow-up question to what we were just talking about. Admiral, you said Secretary Kerry had several things on his plate, and I guess that's an understatement. So my question is, during the U.S. chairmanship, what will be the place of the Arctic in overall U.S. foreign policy? And following up on the last question, what will be the place of the Arctic in the United States' overall relationship with Russia? Because, of course, the United States works with Russia on a multitude of questions, for example, Iran, etc. So the place in the overall U.S. foreign policy and the place in the overall relationship with Russia. Thank you.
Well, it's all a delicate balance. And the closer I get to working in the administration, I mean, I've learned this over a number of years. I use the analogy of bandwidth, if you put it in technical terms. On any given day in Washington, D.C., there's only so much bandwidth to go around. So the Arctic, I can tell you, is very important. President Obama signed 2 years ago the National Arctic Strategy. We have developed an implementation plan for the national strategy, and we attend meetings regularly on that, although sometimes they're displaced because of world events, whether it's Ebola, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and others. Some days there are just crises that come up, and many people work many issues, and they're drawn to do other things. But I can guarantee you that Secretary Kerry is passionate about the Arctic. Just when I started this job, we had the Our Oceans Conference, which I think was attended by 146 countries at the State Department. Many of the things that we talked about at the Our Oceans Conference are applicable and specific to the Arctic as well. And I met with Secretary Kerry on Monday for about an hour before coming here. And I have to tell you that even though I think we've got a very aggressive and forward-leaning program, he wanted to know if we were being aggressive and had enough in the program, or if we were selling ourselves short. So it's an object of passion for him. He and the President both believe deeply that the Arctic is a very high-level strategic interest of ours. They want good order. They want it to be environmentally sound. They want to look after the people that live in the Arctic. And we will devote as much effort as we can to keep this a high priority.
Thank you. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, but when there's a break, look for these two distinguished Americans outside. Thank you very much. So much for lots of questions.
Thank you.